Welcome to this video, which is looking at one of the GCSE English literature texts. This time it's A Christmas Carol, and the focus of this video is the theme of the supernatural and its impact in the novella. Hopefully by the end of this series of videos you will be able to organise your revision so that you'll be well prepared should this question come up in the exam. This section of the video is going to be the same whatever text you are studying. It is basically the assessment objectives. If you don't understand what the assessment objectives mean for you in terms of how you answer a question, you're not going to be writing in a focused way that will enable you to maximise your marks. So what I've done on the next couple of slides is to simplify in plain English exactly what the assessment objectives mean. So on the slide you're looking at the moment, we're looking at the first two assessment objectives for literature. There are 4 in total, but the fourth assessment objective is only used on some of the answers, and that will become clear when we move on to the next slide. So first of all, assessment objective 1. In plain English, this is your ideas in response to the question. So whatever the question is, you need to be able to make sure that everything you say is shaped to answer the question as in a focused a way as you possibly can. So you're not retelling the story, you're actually identifying what the key theme of the question is, and all the ideas that you pick up from the text are shaped to answer that question. Now the mark you get for AO1 is directly impacted by how sophisticated your ideas are. So if you have more subtlety, more complexity in what you're saying in answer to the question, that will get you a mark on a higher level. If your response is very simple, very simplistic, that will obviously limit the mark that you can possibly get. The other part of assessment objective 1 is actually supporting the points you are making with direct evidence from the text. So on some of the questions on the literature papers, you will have extracts. So the Romeo and Juliet question and the A Christmas Carol question, you will have an extract, so you will be able to get some evidence from the exam paper itself. You will also, though, be required to bring in evidence from another part of the text that isn't actually printed on the paper. But for the other text, where you don't necessarily have the question printed on the paper, you will need to memorise quotations to use as evidence. You do, however, get some credit for referring to evidence even if it's not a direct quotation. So if you are stuck but you can't remember exactly what a quotation is, it's perfectly acceptable to use a reference to that without quoting it directly, or to use individual words from the idea that you've remembered, even if you don't use the full quotation. But you've always got to support whatever you are saying in your big ideas with direct evidence. In fact, if you don't do that, the next assessment objective becomes invalid, because assessment objective 2 is understanding writers' methods. So you've offered your evidence, or you've offered the points that you want to make with some evidence, but you need to demonstrate that you understand what the writer's intentions were in the way they have used language or techniques or structures. Now, part of that involves an understanding of the connotations of some of the key words in the evidence that you've supplied. So you need to drill down and really look for the layers of meaning. It is much, much better to have fewer pieces of evidence and to explore them in depth than it is to have lots and lots of evidence that you just superficially attempt to explain. Because assessment objective 2 is really about analysis rather than explanation. So it's not just saying what the evidence means, it's actually demonstrating that you can take your analysis as far as possible. Part of that also, if you look at the final bullet point there, is using correct technical terms. So if you're referring to the parts of speech, do you know what an adjective is, what an adverb is? Can you actually identify the parts of a sentence? If some technique is being used, are you aware of the full range of different language techniques that might be used in a text? Words like metaphor, simile, personification, symbolism. Those are the kind of things that should be part of your familiar vocabulary. So whatever the text is that you're preparing for, you need to make sure you are covering all those things. Final main assessment objective for literature, assessment objective 3, is linking your discussion to the language, culture and beliefs at the time in which the text was written. So if it's a Shakespeare play, having an understanding what beliefs at the time were about the themes in the play and how they might impact how an audience at the time might receive the themes compared with a modern audience. So anything to do with the background to the writing of the text and the time it was set in, and showing an understanding that as a modern audience you might respond to things differently. So whatever the text is, I mean the example there talks about Shakespeare, but obviously if it's a Christmas Carol, so you need to know something about the Industrial Revolution and the effects of that on the world in which Dickens was writing. If you're looking at the poetry, each poem has a very specific cultural references and background, and you need to show some understanding of those ideas. Assessment objective 4 for the complete exam is only actually applied for the first question on paper 1 and the first question on paper 2, and it is a simple mark out of 4 for the accuracy of your use of language, so how well you express yourself, but also things like spelling, punctuation and grammar. For the purpose of preparing this particular video, which is focusing on the supernatural in A Christmas Carol, I'm only going to be referring to assessment objectives 1, 2 and 3 because they are the main assessment objectives. So assessment objective 1 is all about making points that are relevant to what you're being asked in the question. So in this video, this introductory video, what we're looking at is organising our ideas for the supernatural, so you know what the kind of things are that you're going to say. Obviously supernatural is a huge part of A Christmas Carol, and there's lots and lots that you can say. You can't possibly say it all in an exam response to a question on the supernatural, so you need to be selective and have some very clear ideas in your head of the things that you can go to time and again, regardless of exactly which extract is used or exactly what question you're being asked. You can use these points again and again and again, and it will simplify the revision process because you can keep going back to those same points, because regardless of the question, these points will be relevant. What you need to do is shape the points to answer the question that is being asked precisely, to make sure that you're showing the examiner that you understand the requirements of the task in front of you. We're going to be looking at also the evidence that you might gather in support of some of those points that you might make too. It is impossible when you do an exam answer to separate all these three things off. I would discourage you in any exam response to follow a very strict point evidence analysis format for this, because it's much better if you can just make sure you're hitting the assessment objectives and that you have written in a style where you are referring to context in your opening sentence, analysing language, giving your evidence, all in complex sentences where evidence is embedded, rather than wasting your time with sentence starters which just slow the process down. So you could say my first point is, and say what your point is. You could say my evidence is, and say what your evidence is. And you could say this evidence shows that, but it's very dull, it's very formulaic, and it shows the examiner that you're not a sophisticated writer. So if you can move beyond using those structures, it is much better and will give you a much better chance of producing a response that will be really good and get the highest marks. So this is over to you now. There will be a few points in this video where I will ask you to pause. So what I want you to do is to have a pad of paper and a pen handy and have a go at actually trying out these tasks yourself, rather than just watching and copying down the things that are in the video. So there are 5 segments to the sheet that you can see on the video at the moment. So pause the video now, and we're going to focus on, well, not now, wait until I finished the instruction. We're going to focus on the top left-hand corner, big ideas. So if I were to say to you, what is the role of the supernatural in A Christmas Carol? What big ideas could you come up with? What are they mainly to do with? So pause the video, spend at least 3 minutes thinking about the main events. Let's see what you can come up with. Okay, you might not have exactly what you can see on the screen there, but hopefully you will touch on some of the ideas that are here. Now, my message to you is if you can focus on 3 key ideas and remember those, whatever the question is to do with the supernatural, these will always be relevant. And in fact, these big ideas are relevant to lots and lots of different questions that you might be asked on A Christmas Carol. The story obviously centres around Scrooge, and the visit of all the different supernatural beings has an impact on Scrooge. They teach him lessons, and the lessons they teach are slightly different. You will notice on the sheet I've put in red below each of the spirits a word or two, and those to me sum up how Scrooge behaves towards each of those spirits. So when Marley arrives, he's very dismissive of Marley initially. That changes as the visit goes on. He's much more polite to the Ghost of Christmas Past, mostly, apart from when he tries to put the extinguisher cap on his head. By the time the Ghost of Christmas Present comes, he's very respectful. And then by the end, the final spirit is humble and fearful. So you can see how that journey is impacted by the way each of the spirits show him the things that are teaching him a lesson. So I think that's a really key important point. Whatever question you get, whatever extract you get, there will be something there about the lessons that the supernatural, whichever spirit it is, teaches Scrooge. So if you know what each one of them teaches Scrooge, you can bring in ideas from elsewhere in the text as well. Linked to that is the second bullet point. It's really kind of the same thing. They actually bring about a change, because the Scrooge we see in stave 1 is a completely different man from the Scrooge we see in stave 5, and obviously that happens as a result of the visits of the spirits. The second main point I think you should always mention, whatever the question is, certainly for the supernatural, but pretty much any question at all, is the message of the Christian message. The fact that the supernatural is there to reinforce the Christian message to Scrooge, but also to the readers, because it's called A Christmas Carol, because Christmas is a celebration of Christ. And one of the main reasons why Dickens wanted people to celebrate Christ is because he saw Christian teachings as teachings that show that people need to be kinder to each other and to support each other. So, so far we've got Scrooge and we've got the idea of the Christian message. Linked to that, but a separate point, is about the consequences of selfishness and greed. You could add on to that the flip side of that is actually helping the poor as well, because the world in which Dickens lived was a rapidly changing world following the Industrial Revolution. London had become overpopulated. It meant, because of the factories, people had to move from the rural areas into urban areas, and all the cottage industries that existed were basically destroyed. People were working for not a lot of money in factories in very, very dangerous conditions. There were far too many people to work in the factories, therefore they were paid low wages, so even people who were working had very little money. And what Dickens is trying to show through the visit of the spirit is the people who are rich, that they need to do something to help people who are less fortunate. So I think those are the 3 big ideas on the role of the supernatural in A Christmas Carol, whatever the question. Now, you could get an extract that if you got a question on the supernatural on any 4 of the spirits, and you need to be able to link those ideas in whichever the spirit is. But also what you need to be able to do is to come up with specific details in each of the staves where each spirit appears that you can link into that. So Marley's ghost appears in stave 1. So what I want you to do now is pause the video again. This time I want you to list everything you can remember about the impact that Marley's ghost has on Scrooge. Okay, so pause the video now. Let's see what you can come up with. Okay, now this might not be everything, but these are the things that I thought about when I carried out this activity. So the first thing that Marley does, because Marley is very, very similar to Scrooge in that he lived a similar life, he was his business partner, he can show firsthand to Scrooge the consequences of sin. So the first thing he does is to show the chains. They are a metaphor. He has to drag these chains around, and he tells Scrooge that if he doesn't change his ways, he will have chains as long as this, plus 7 years worth of sin. So that's a really important thing, to shock Scrooge and to make Scrooge realise that something needs to happen. So that's the second bullet point there, shocking Scrooge into action. I think the other thing about Marley's ghost, even though Marley says, or gives the impression there isn't much chance for Scrooge to be saved, he's also, at the same time, the fact that he's appeared and he's speaking to Scrooge, paradoxically, shows that there is an opportunity to change. And the key word here is redemption. Redemption is being saved. So what Marley's ghost does is introduce the idea to Scrooge that he can be saved. Now at that point, Scrooge isn't very open to the idea, he's very dismissive of Marley's ghost. But in fact, when he's given the option of the spirits coming, he says, can I just get them all over with all at once? He doesn't treat it as seriously as he might, because he's terrified. But it introduces the idea that he needs to do something about his life to bring about a change. Okay, the second spirit is the ghost of Christmas past. So same thing again, pause the video, what can you come up with? Okay, I think the Ghost of Christmas Past serves a very specific function that's different from the other spirits, and that is to remind Scrooge of the things from the past that he's lost sight of. Now, there's lots of detail there, and the list I have put on the slide there is not exhaustive, but you can't write about everything. So I focused in on the big things. So we know that he has a family, specifically his sister, who has passed away, but we see her as a young girl, and he's reminded of the love of his family. Now that's important because he's very dismissive of his sister Fan's son, Fred, who keeps coming around and trying to encourage Scrooge to become a part of his family celebrations of Christmas. And in the first day, we see Fred being rejected again. And that's obviously a key theme, the importance of family. The other thing that the Ghost of Christmas Past reminds Scrooge of is the importance of being a kind and thoughtful boss. Again, in stave 1, we see his treatment of the clerk. Now, at that stage, his relationship with Bob Cratchit, who is the clerk, seems so distant he doesn't even use his name. He's in the cell where he works, and he's only allowed a single coal to put on the fire, so he's absolutely freezing. And he begrudges Bob Cratchit the pay that he gets for Christmas Day. So, you know, he sees his first boss, Fezziwig, who is a larger-than-life man who is full of Christian spirit, and it reminds him that he needs to be a better boss. The final big memory, I think, that is shared with Scrooge in stave 2, is his relationship with Belle. Now, Belle was his fiancée, and she actually broke off their engagement despite the fact that he was wealthy, because she realised he was more in love with money than he was with her. And what Scrooge is shown is the breaking off of the engagement, but also Belle later in life. In fact, the same night that Jacob Marley dies, we're shown Belle with her husband and children, and it's torturous for Scrooge because he realises what he could have had his life taken a different path. So again, some very, very painful memories, but reminders for Scrooge about what is important in life. Okay, so the next spirit is the Ghost of Christmas Present. So same thing again, please. Pause the video, get your pen at the ready. What can you remember about the Ghost of Christmas Present? Okay, now the Ghost of Christmas Present, when he arrives, Scrooge is quite cowed by him because he's a giant. He's on top of a huge throne of food. He's a giant because he's larger than life, because he's Christmas present. The word present obviously refers to time, but it has other connotations too, because we give presents at Christmas time. So in a way, he's a kind of present to Scrooge, and he's present because he's there, and it's here and now, and it is as things happen. It would be the day that Scrooge would have that actual Christmas. So he's shown what would happen that Christmas. Now, he's shown some really important things that I think are the heart of why Christmas is important. And I think it's important that the Christmas present shows him this. And it all focuses on people enjoying Christmas and the Christian message. So the first visit is to the Cratchits, who are a very, very poor family. And Scrooge learns a lot about them, which I think brings about some empathy. But it isn't just about feeling sorry for the Cratchits. The Ghost of Christmas Present needs him to learn more than that. So he shows him other people as well. He shows him the poor Cratchits and how grateful they are for the very little that they have. And he shows him Fred enjoying his Christmas with his friends as well. But we're also shown lots of other people who are not really identified very much, but touched upon. He has a journey out to sea. So first of all, he goes to the mines and sees people there celebrating Christmas. He goes to the lighthouse and sees people there celebrating Christmas, and then some men on a ship. And all of them, despite their isolation, all celebrate Christmas. And light is a theme that runs right the way through all that journey and all the places that he goes to visit. But I think the crucial thing about the Ghost of Christmas Present, linking in with the visiting the Cratchits, is that it isn't about specifics. It's not just about helping the Cratchits, because Dickens wants the readers at the time to know that this is a broader problem. So right at the end of the stave, from under the Ghost of Christmas Present's gown, two children emerge who look more like animals really than children, and he says they are ignorance and want. And I think what he's doing there is demonstrating, Dickens, that if you have people who are very rich and keep all the wealth, there is a consequence at the other end of the spectrum. The poorest people, if they're not educated and they don't have enough, they will be dangerous. And it is a warning. And I think the warning is there to the rich people who refuse to help, the rich people like Scrooge. And Scrooge has to realise, before he can be redeemed, that it's not just about helping the Cratchits, it's about helping everyone. And that's what the spirit of Christmas is. And that's what the Ghost of Christmas Present represents. Finally, Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. So same deal, pause the video, let's see what you can come up with. Okay, this is the final stage. The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come doesn't speak, he shows. And I think what he's trying to show Scrooge is where he will end up. Scrooge doesn't realise though, he can't see himself, but when he looks at the future, he doesn't realise he's being shown himself. So it's almost unbelievable for the reader that Scrooge doesn't realise this is about him, but he doesn't, because he has to come to that understanding to basically complete the cycle of redemption. So he's shown and things are pointed out to him, but he has to get there himself, which is why, one of the reasons why I think the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come doesn't speak. In fact, we don't even see a face. All we see is an outstretched arm and hand, because the future hasn't happened yet. He can't speak, so there is nothing. It's not decided. What will decide it is Scrooge's response. So what he's shown is the consequences of someone dying who is a greedy businessman of the kind that he is. Now, he doesn't know it at the time, but it is actually his own body that he sees under the cloth. But we're shown lots of different consequences of that death. But the overriding feeling is that the death isn't mourned at all. So we see his rich business colleagues who are more interested in a free lunch and aren't at all concerned that he's passed, and not at all sorry that he's passed, even though he counts them, as a couple of them, as people who he thought he had a decent business relationship with, which goes to show what Dickens thinks of business relationships, so that they are actually loving relationships at all. The other thing we're showing is the kind of underbelly, which I think links a bit to ignorance and want. All the belongings that Scrooge has that are stolen by various people who come across him after his death, and they're taken to Old Joe's and sold. And you can see in some of the things that the three people are who steal those things, you can see why they've done it. They basically say, well, if he lived his life like that, why shouldn't we benefit from his death? Even going as far as taking the expensive shirt off his dead body and replacing it with a cheaper calico one, and taking the curtains from around the bed. So it's quite shocking what they take and their attitude to it, but it's the flip side of what happens if people are greedy. The poorer people will also do things to grab things for themselves too. Scrooge asks for some sign of people who have more fonder feelings as a result of this man's death, and he's then shown a couple who are in debt, who are relieved because this man has died, because it means that they will have longer to sort out their finances. He's then shown the death of Tiny Tim as a contrast, Dickens showing that this Christian family, they've had their young son taken away from them, the young brother taken away from them, and there's a lot of tenderness in that really beautiful scene when Bob returns alone, having sorted out the arrangements for the funeral, and you can feel the Christian love that all the family have for each other and how close they are. And then at the end, when realization dawns on Scrooge, he can see that what he faces is basically a very lonely, unloved death. And ultimately, it doesn't actually say it, but ultimately, he won't be going to heaven. He'll have the fate that has been enacted on Marley following his death. And at the end, Scrooge has the opportunity of redemption, and he takes it. He renounces his sins. He promises to lead a full life and helping other people.